divided into two hemispheres from the aerial view. From the aerial view, it looks divided into two hemispheres. We have the left and the right. My left side is the left side of the brain, and right side is the right side of the brain. It is divided into two hemispheres, the left and the right, by a long median longitudinal fissure. Alright? Though it appears to be divided, it is joined together by a membrane called the corpus callosum. About this we have already discussed. So let's go a little further. The forebrain, that is basically made up of the cerebrum. The forebrain or the cerebrum is made up of two regions. It is made up of two regions. It is divided into two regions. The outer region called the cortex, or it is called cerebral cortex, and the inner region called the medulla, or the cerebral medulla. The outer region, the cerebral cortex, consists mostly of cell bodies. It has a large concentration of cell bodies. We have large concentration of cell bodies. Cell bodies is the largest part of a neuron, that is a nerve cell. Nerve cell ko sabai bhanda thulo bhagलाई चाहिँ cell bodies भन्छ. And in this particular region, in the cortex region, we have large concentration of cell bodies, because of which it appears to be pretty dense, and it appears to be a greyish in color. It appears to be greyish in color. That is why it is called grey matter. The cortex consists of large number of cell bodies. That is why it is called grey matter. It appears to be greyish in color. Whereas the medulla has mostly the axon fibers. It has mostly the axon fibers, and it has mostly the axon fibers, and because of which it appears to be whitish in color. That is why this is called white matter. So the outer cortex consists of large number of cell bodies. That is why it is called greyish in color. That is why it is called grey matter. And the inner medulla consists mostly of axon fibers, and that is why it appears to be whitish in color. That's why it is also called the white matter. Now, in this diagram, what I have drawn here, I have drawn the cerebral, the outer layer, the margin of the cerebrum as smooth, but it is not so smooth. It is actually thrown out into folds. It is thrown out into folds like this, and these folds, because of these folds, the content of the grey matter is increased. There is more, you can say, amount of grey matter because of these, what we call them as convolutions. Because of these convolutions, the foldings that is thrown out into folds, the surface area of the cerebrum increases, and thus increases the amount of grey matter, which increases the intelligence of a person. So it is also said, more number of convolutions means a more intelligent person. And it is believed Einstein had the largest number of convolutions so far, and that is why he happened to be the most intelligent man on the surface of the earth. Now, these convolutions have been given name. These convolutions have a crest, the bulges which are known as the gyri. The bulges known as the gyri, and this folds which form a groove within, these are known as the sulci. These are known as the sulci. The fissures that forms is known as the sulci, and the bulges that protrude outside are called the gyri. It is made up of sulci and gyri. Sulci are the grooves that forms, that gives an impression of the fissures that is present. The grooves are known as the sulci, and the bulges are known as the gyri. This is an important point which we need to remember. As I have already told you, more number of gyri means more number of convolutions, and more number of convolutions means more amount of grey matter, and thus more intelligence. The person becomes more intelligent. The cerebral medulla is the inner layer of the cerebrum, and it is whitish in color because it contains mostly the axon fibers. Okay? Most of the actual information processing in the brain takes place in the cerebral cortex. That is why we can say the intelligence of a person is determined by the size of the cerebral cortex, the number of convolutions that is there. Whatever decision has to be made, it is by the cerebral cortex because it contains large number of cell body. Now the cerebral cortex is divided into number of lobes. The cerebral cortex is divided into number of lobes. The first region is called the frontal lobe. The first region is called the frontal lobe, and this is involved in the decision making process, problem solving and planning. The frontal lobe is mostly concerned with decision making processes, problem solving and planning. Then we have the parietal lobe. This particular region called the parietal lobe. I'll rub this out. This particular region called the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is involved with reception and processing of sensory information from the body. Whatever sensory information comes from the body first goes to the parietal lobe, where it is processed, it is received and it is processed, and to find out what kind of information it is. Then we have at the rear end we have the occipital. I'll rub this out. This region is called the occipital lobe, which is basically involved in the visual processing. It helps in the vision. It is involved with vision. Then we have a region here. In this particular region, this is called the temporal lobe. This is called the temporal lobe, which is basically involved with memory, emotion, hearing and language. This particular lobe, temporal lobe, is concerned with memory, emotion, hearing and language. So these are the four different regions of the brain: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe. As the name suggests, temporal lobe lies somewhere next to the temple. Cerebral cortex is again divided into hemispheres, left and right, which we have talked about, and it is divided by a median longitudinal fissure. The fissure, the sulci, which is very deep along the longitudinal medians, it divides the entire cerebral cortex into two hemispheres. The cerebral cortex is further divided into motor cortex and sensory cortex. That means the motor cortex is involved with the motor functions, and centenary cortex is related with the sensory functions. Now, after the idea about the cerebrum, we go to the next part of the central nervous system, that is the thalamus. The thalamus is a region inside the cerebrum, just below the forebrain, where there is large concentration of cell bodies, or we can say large concentration of grey matter. And this is a specialized region which lies slightly above the third ventricle. Now, in this we need to understand what is ventricle. Ventricles are spaces inside the brain, which are fluid-filled spaces, which is basically filled up with cerebrospinal fluid and cerebrospinal fluid, spaces inside the brain. We have this sort of arrangement. 1, 2, 3, and another one down here, which is 4. There are 4 spaces inside the brain, which are called the ventricles. And these spaces are filled up with fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid. This is ventricle number 1, number 2, and number 3. And another we have down here is number 4. This is just to have an idea what is the ventricle. So these ventricles are spaces inside the brain. Now here we have the third ventricle which is present. The third ventricle, this is this region. The ventricles are like this. The third ventricle that is present here inside the brain. The third ventricle, just above this, there is a collection of, this is the floor of the forebrain, the floor of the forebrain. We have a large collection of cell bodies or the grey matter. This is what is known as the thalamus. This is known as the thalamus. And the thalamus has a very important role to play. The functions are: acts as a relay station, receives afferent, that is sensory fibers from all parts of the body, and sends efferent motor fibers, important centers for emotion and reflex activities. So basically the function of the thalamus, it acts as a relay station because it receives all the sensory information that is brought by the sensory nerves, and from there all the efferent nerves or the motor nerves arise, motor fibers arise, and they send the information further, whatever information needs to be taken to different parts of the body. So basically the main function of the thalamus is it acts as a relay station, though it is important in controlling our emotions, our temperature regulation, thermoregulations, and other reflex activities as well. So that is what is thalamus. Now, just a region below this, below the third ventricle, there is another specialized region which is called hypothalamus. Hypothalamus. Hypo means below. So hypothalamus gives you an idea that it lies below the thalamus. Thalamus माथिबाट छ, त्यसको मुनिबाट चाहिँ hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is another important region which lies at the floor of the third ventricle. That means we have the third ventricle somewhere here in between. At the floor of this, we have the hypothalamus. Above this, we have the thalamus, and below this, we have the hypothalamus. This is the third ventricle. This is the third ventricle which lies in between the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The function of the hypothalamus is thermoregulation, osmoregulation. Thermoregulation means, thermo means temperature, and regulation means it controls, it coordinates, it balances. So basically hypothalamus is a thermoregulatory center. It regulates the body temperature. And osmoregulation comes with a word that is, it helps in the fluid balance in our body, basically water balance in our body. It regulates the balance of water in our body. So another important function is osmoregulation. Then it controls emotional and sexual behavior of a person as well. Hypothalamus controls the emotional and sexual behavior of the persons as well. It also controls hunger and satiety. Hunger means when we have less amount of nutrients of food in our body, and because of which we have you can say reflex, with the help of which tells us that our food reserves is empty, so you better fill it up. And satiety means when you start eating and suddenly you start saying like, okay, I'm enough, I had enough. That feeling of having enough after a meal is what is known as satiety. It controls the secretory activities of the pituitary as well. As we already know, hypothalamus produces releasing hormones. These hormones controls the activity of the pituitary. Like thyroid releasing hormone, which controls the pituitary to release TSH, that is thyroid stimulating hormone. So it controls the activity of the pituitary, and which indirectly controls the activity of different endocrine glands of our body. That is about the cerebrum, thalamus and the hypothalamus. This comes under the forebrain. Now we move on with the midbrain. We have finished with the forebrain. The forebrain basically consists of the cerebrum, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now we talk about the midbrain. Midbrain connects the forebrain with the hindbrain. Now, if you just try to open this up, it looks something like this. These are the two hemispheres of the brain. Two hemispheres of the brain, the cerebral hemispheres. This region of the brain, which consists of basically of the brain stem, which is basically made up of the brain stem. This particular region is called the midbrain. It is made up of the peduncle of the cerebellum, and the, you can say, tegmental region of the brain, or the brain stem. This particular region is called the midbrain, and it basically connects the forebrain, that is the cerebrum, the thalamus and the hypothalamus, with the later part, that is the hindbrain. So it basically helps in connecting connecting the hindbrain with the forebrain. Its main important function, it is made up of brain stem and peduncle. Or we can also say cerebral peduncle. Its important function serves as the center for mediating visual, auditory and tactile impulses. So whatever visual information, whatever auditory information, whatever tactile information passes through this particular region. That is the brain stem. That is the midbrain. This is the midbrain. These two regions make up the forebrain. This makes up the midbrain. And it basically helps in as a center for mediating visual, auditory and tactile impulses. Now we move on to the hindbrain. The hindbrain is basically made up of the second largest part of the brain, that is the cerebellum, pons, and finally medulla oblongata. Does not fit here. It's basically made up of medulla oblongata. So the hindbrain, this is the midbrain. The hindbrain is made up of the cerebellum, pons, and medulla oblongata. As we know, the medulla oblongata further proceeds as the spinal cord, which part of the backbone. But in the hindbrain, we have the cerebellum, pons, and medulla oblongata. These three regions makes up the hindbrain. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain, and it joined to the brain stem by a structure called the peduncle, which comes into the midbrain. The peduncle region comes into the midbrain. So it is joined to the brain stem by the peduncle, made up of two hemispheres. As we know, cerebellum is also made up of two hemispheres, and it lies below the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe ko muni chai tyo dekhincha. The function of the hindbrain: maintain muscle tone. The main function of the hindbrain, that is basically the function of the cerebellum. It helps in maintaining the muscle tone. It helps in the contraction and relaxation of especially the muscles of the limb. It helps in the coordinated movement of the body. It helps in walking and running. It also maintains the equilibrium of the body. That means the body has to remain in equilibrium. It maintains the posture of the body. The function of the pons, it basically helps in regulating the respiratory, cardiac, vasomotor, and heart rate and blood pressure. That is the function of the pons. Respiratory, cardiac, vasomotor, regulates respiration, heart rate, and blood pressure. That is the function of the pons. Medulla oblongata, it is the last part of the brain and regulates respiratory, vasomotor, and cardiac activities. Controls visceral reflexes as well. Visceral reflexes means the reflexes of the different organs of the body. Whatever is required, whatever changes your body is going through, whatever changes that your organs are going through is, controlled by the medulla oblongata. So this much for today. We finished discussing about the different parts of the brain. We've discussed about the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain.